Okay, so this is the preview presentation on Book 12, which Emily Wilson, in her translation, titles Difficult Choices, one of the great understatements in all of Western literature. Difficult choices. This also represents the end of a particular part um, of the epic, and that part is the series of chapters in which Odysseus is narrating his recent adventures to the court of the Phaeacians, to Alcinous and Nausicaa and Arete. First, I think in the context of a class or a book group or a discussion, I think this chapter, boiled to its basics, is largely about how we see in our own lives what a good leader is. And I think it's important to always be mindful that every book creates its own definitions of things. So what a good leader is in the Odyssey might actually be different than what a good leader is even in the Iliad. It definitely is different than a good leader in other great works of literature. This is its own sort of self-contained universe with its own value system and its own challenges. But in general, it's interesting to think about what makes a great leader, right? Whether it's a particular kind of fortitude, strength, courage, prudence, wisdom, foresight. So it might be interesting to brainstorm a list of traits, because that might condition us to read this chapter, which is largely about Odysseus guiding, or as the case may be, not guiding his men. So after the previous chapter, where we go into the underworld of Hades, Odysseus returns to Aea and keeps his promise to Elpenor, the younger soldier who dies tragically by falling off the roof. And like all people, he wants an honorable burial. So if you go to line 116, go to line 8, I should say, line 9. I sent my men to Xerxes' house to bring the body of dead Elpenor. Quickly we chopped the wood, and at the farthest headland we held a funeral for him and wept profusely, crying out in grief. We burned his body and his gear and built a mound and dragged a pillar onto it and fixed his oar on top, each ritual step in turn. So all this is not only his wishes, which when we bury a loved one, we always pay attention to what their wishes are. But here also it's honoring actually someone who's not heroic, who didn't die a heroic death, and who's not a hero. So that's kind of curious. That's the beginning of Book 12. So if you go to line 35, this is on page 302. This is somewhat reminiscent of Tiresias. Odysseus is getting a lot of directions. It's amazing to me that he doesn't have the ability to take notes in his iPhone or in a notebook, because Tiresias gave him numerous, predictions of things to come, very specific predictions of things to come. And around line 35, Xerxes tells Odysseus what the next chapter of his adventures are going to be. So let's look at this. Let's look at this closely here. Line 35. Xerxes says to Odysseus, "That quest is over now, so listen, I'll give you good instructions. Another god will make sure you remember." Okay, this is number one. First, you'll reach the Sirens. And yes, that's where we get the idea of a fire truck siren, a police siren. Except here, the siren song is sort of intoxicating in a way. Who bewitch all passerby. If anyone goes near them in ignorance and listens to their voices, that man will never travel to his home, and never make his wife and children happy to have him back with them again. So again, make sure you're underlining the stuff we're reading out loud. But this is the greatest evil in Odysseus's life, is not only not returning home, but even losing the desire to return home, that sense of nostalgia, the longing, the pain of not being at home. Losing that is the greatest of evils. So the siren song isn't just pleasant, it makes you not even want to return home. The sirens who sit there in their meadow will seduce him with piercing songs. Around about them lie great heaps of men, flesh rotting from their bones, their skin all shriveled up. So here are her suggestions. Use wax to plug your sailors' ears as you row past, and that way they won't be able to hear the siren song. So they're deaf to the songs. But if you wish to hear them, it's almost like she knows Odysseus isn't going to follow directions and he's not a rule guy. If you wish to hear them, your men must fasten you to your ship's mast by hand and foot, straight upright, with tight ropes, so bound you can enjoy the siren's song. But if you beg your men to set you free, they have to tie you down with firmer knots. I'll not give you definite instructions about which route to take when you've sailed beyond the sirens. Let your heart decide. There are two choices. So once you get beyond the sirens, he has two terrible choices to pick from. Watch. The first goes through vast overhanging rocks, which Amphitrite batters aggressively with mighty waves. The blessed gods call these the wandering rocks. No birds can fly through safe, not even doves who bring ambrosia to Zeus. One dove is always lost in that sheer gulf of stone, and Zeus must send another to restore the number of the flock. No human ship has ever passed there. So in this area of murk and fog, you go to the last line of page 303, around line 84. It says, there lives, last few words of page 303, there lives Scylla, howling and barking horribly. Now listen to this is one of the paths Odysseus can take. Howling and barking horribly, her voice is puppy-like, but she's dangerous. Even a god would be afraid of her. She has 12 dangling necks and 6 legs and 6 long necks, 12 legs, 6 necks, with a gruesome head on each, and in each face 3 rows of crowded teeth. And I love this phrase in Emily Wilson's translation, pregnant with death. They're expectant of death, right? Her belly slumps inside the hollow cave. She keeps her head above the yawning chasm and scopes around the rock and hunts for fish. She catches dolphins, seals, and sometimes even enormous whales. Queen Amphitrite, ruler of roaring waters, nurtures many creatures. No sailors ever pass that way unharmed. She snatches one man with each mouth from off each dark, proud ship. The other rock is near, enough to shoot an arrow right across. The second rock is lower down, and on it there grows a fig tree with thick leaves. So number one is Scylla, the 12-legged, 6-headed monster. Then the second path he could take leads to Charybdis, which is a huge whirlpool in the ocean, and it sucks black water down. 3 times a day she spurts it up, 3 times she glugs it down. Avoid that place, this is what Circe tells Odysseus. When she's swallowing the water, no one could save you from death then, even great Poseidon. And here's her tip. Row fast, that seems kind of obvious, and steer your ship alongside Scylla, since it's better if you lose 6 men than all of them. So he has to have this sort of calculus, you know. Here's this really interesting interaction. I think this is totally worth talking about. Odysseus says, I answered, Goddess, please tell me the truth. Is there no other way? He's always looking for a way around what's in front of him. Or can I somehow circumvent, work around Charybdis and stop that Scylla when she tries to kill my men? Listen to Circe's response. Make sure you mark this. The goddess answered, no, you fool. Your mind is still obsessed with deeds of war, but now you must surrender to the gods. She's aware that Odysseus he has learned from warfare to be in disguise, to hide, to cheat, to do anything to survive. But the problem is, in the world of the divine, you can't cheat your way around it. And this is what she's reminding him of. And then number 3 in line 128 is after he survives the Scylla-Charybdis conflict, she says in 128, then you'll reach the island called Thrinacia, where Helios keeps sheep and many cattle, 50 per herd with 7 herds in all. And in line 138, the very simple command that we've heard multiple times, line 138, leave the cows unharmed. These are the cattle of the sun god Helios. You're going to land there. You can't touch the cattle. I mean, you know it's coming. I mean, it's no wonder. So again, we have obstacle 1, the sirens. And here we have Odysseus's men with wax in their ears and Odysseus tied to the mast, and all the sirens are chanting to him, right? And let's pay attention. It's fascinating. Go to line 183 of the books. Because here's what the sirens say. So we don't know what the sirens would have sounded like, but listen to what they say to Odysseus. What would be intoxicating and tempting to Odysseus? 183 on page 307. Odysseus, come here. You're well known for many stories, glory of the Greeks. Now stop your ship and listen to our voices. All those who pass this way hear honeyed song. poured from our mouths. The music brings them joy, and they go on their way with greater knowledge. Since we know everything the Greeks and Trojans suffered in Troy by God's will, and we know whatever happens anywhere on earth. So they kind of flatter him, right? And then they tell him that they know everything about what happened in the Trojan War and what happened afterwards. It's really interesting. And then here we have Scylla, and we have Charybdis, right? The great whirlpool. All right. And then we have the island of the sun god, which he's told these are all the sort of obstacles he's going to face. Now, if you go to line 156, what I'd like to encourage you to think about is go back to your original conception of leader. And Circe tells him about all these obstacles: the Sirens, the 12-legged, 6-headed monster, the whirlpool that destroys everything in its path. Don't eat the cattle of the sun god. And go to page 306, line 155. Here's what Odysseus says to his guys after talking to Circe. My friends, the revelations Circe shared with me should not be kept a secret, known to me alone. Okay, I'll share them with you. Yep, you just said that. And we can die in knowledge of the truth or else escape. She said we must avoid the voices of the otherworldly sirens, steer past their flowering meadow, and she says that I alone should hear their singing. Bind me to keep me upright at the mast, wound round with rope. If I beseech you and command you to set me free, you must increase my bonds and chain me even tighter. Okay, so that's a somewhat incomplete version of the story. He doesn't tell them about Scylla and Charybdis later on, so that's worth watching. And I'm just going to say, if you can go to line 250, it's page 309, he sees Scylla eat several of his men, 6 men, and they're crying in agony. And it's sort of like when a fish gets thrown on the dock and is gasping out his last breath. That's the epic simile in 250 that he compares it to. But look at what he says at the end of that stanza, right around 258. That was the most heart-rending sight I saw in all the time I suffered on the sea. Think of all the suffering Odysseus has experienced. And he says the most heart-rending sight he ever saw is when Scylla devoured 6 men in front of him. He's seen the Cyclops eat his men. He's seen all kinds of men die in the Battle of Troy. So an interesting conversation would be, what's special, what's different about this? So that might be worth thinking about. On line 320, if you go to page 311, line 320, he warns his guys, he reminds them, my friends, we have supplies on board. Let us not touch the cattle or we'll regret it. I don't know how strong his warning is. He falls asleep and his men do the predictable thing. Their supplies run out and they get hungry. So I guess my question is, based on Odysseus' own behavior, based on Odysseus' advice of his men, and based on what literally happens, does Book 12 suggest that Odysseus is a good leader? And if he's the hero of the poem, does that also mean he's a good leader? Or is heroism and leadership two different things? These are just some conversation topics and some themes kind of floating in and out of Book 12. There's many more that we can discuss, but I hope this brief introduction helps you with your reading. Enjoy the poem.